Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if your psychotherapy is working and what working even means for you? This fascinating study dives deep into what people actually say changes for them after therapy. Today, we're exploring a super interesting study that looks at what people actually feel and report as the big wins after going to therapy. Think of it like this. Therapists and researchers often have their own ideas about what counts as success, like ticking off a list of symptoms. But what about what the person experiencing it all, feels has actually changed? This research digs into just that, and it has some pretty cool takeaways about how similar these changes might be for everyone, no matter their problem or their therapist. Okay, so the big question this research team wanted to answer is this. Do the kinds of changes people report after therapy depend on things like what problem they brought to therapy in the first place, or what type of therapy they went through? They also looked at whether the researchers' own beliefs, when they collected the data, or even when the study was published, made a difference. Basically, imagine you've got a bunch of studies all about what people said changed for them in therapy. The first step, done in an earlier study by these same researchers, was to group all those reported changes into bigger categories. They found 10 main outcome clusters or types of change, things like feeling more self-aware, understanding yourself better, or changes in how you handle emotions or behave. But then the huge question was, do these categories stay the same even if the original studies looked at different problems, used different therapy styles, or were done by researchers with different ideas? This current study is like a deeper dive into that meta-analysis. They took that list of 10 outcome areas and looked at them through the lens of the original study's details. So what did they do? They looked at data from 177 previous studies. These studies all gathered information from people about their experiences in therapy. They then checked how often each of the 10 outcome clusters showed up in studies that had different characteristics. They looked at things like, were the clients dealing with just one problem or many problems at once? What kind of therapy was used by the therapist? What were the beliefs or the theoretical orientation of the researchers doing the study? When was the information collected right after therapy ended, or much later? And how many people were in each study? They wanted to see if these details influenced what clients reported as the biggest changes. It is like they became super sleuths of past therapy research. They gathered all the original studies that met their criteria. A lot of filtering happened to make sure they were only looking at studies where clients themselves talked about the outcomes. They then carefully extracted information about the presenting issues, the type of therapy, the researcher's background, and when the data was collected. Some of this info wasn't in the original papers, so they even reached out to the original authors to get more details. Talk about dedication. The good news is that the other authors on the team checked their work to make sure everything was consistent. Now, for the really juicy part, what did they find? The overall message is actually pretty surprising and also quite hopeful. They discovered that across the board, the 10 outcome clusters that clients reported were remarkably stable. This means that things like self-understanding, emotional functioning, and how people relate to others tended to show up regardless of the specific problems people brought to therapy or the type of therapy they received. Let's break down some of the specific findings. When they compared studies where clients had a single well-defined issue, like just depression, versus studies where clients had multiple mixed issues like depression and anxiety together, there were some small differences. For example, clients with multiple issues were a bit more likely to talk about changes in their attitude towards self and their relational and social functioning. They were also a bit more likely to mention changes that weren't directly about therapy itself, but more about life changes in general. But here is the kicker. For most of the other outcome areas, the changes reported were very similar. This suggests that even with different problems, the core ways people feel better often overlap. And when they looked at specific diagnoses within the single issue group, like depression versus trauma, they found only one significant difference. Studies on trauma survivors were more likely to report symptom and problem change compared to studies on people with physical symptoms. Again, most other outcome areas were pretty consistent. This next finding is really big. They found absolutely no statistically significant differences in the outcome clusters reported. Based on the therapeutic approach, whether clients were seeing a cognitive behavioral therapist, a psychodynamic therapist, or a humanistic therapist, the types of changes they reported were largely the same. And get this, it was the same story when they looked at the theoretical orientation of the researchers who conducted the studies. Even if a researcher came from a specific background like CBT or psychodynamic theory, it didn't seem to significantly change the types of outcomes clients reported. This is important because sometimes studies might be biased by the researcher's own beliefs. But here, the client's voice seems to cut through. They even noted that in a lot of studies, the therapist's approach and the researcher's orientation were the same, meaning any potential influence would be hard to untangle anyway. But the overall result is still striking. Here is one area where they did find a slight difference. When data was collected immediately after therapy ended, clients reported behavioral functioning changes less often compared to when data was collected later on. The researchers suggest this makes sense. Big changes in behavior often take time to become noticeable and feel stable. After therapy, someone might feel better emotionally or think more clearly, but it takes real-world practice and time to see those translate into consistent new behaviors. So it is not that the changes didn't happen, but they might not have been as apparent or as easily reported right away. What about how things have changed over time? They looked at studies from as far back as 1948. Interestingly, there wasn't a strong link between the year of publication and the number of outcome clusters identified. While there was a slight dip in the number of clusters in more recent studies, they interpret this not as a narrowing of what clients experience, but possibly a trend towards more unified and integrated ways of categorizing these outcomes as the research field matures. Finally, they looked at sample size. This is where they found a small to moderate association. Studies with larger sample sizes tended to identify a higher number of outcome clusters. This makes intuitive sense. With more people involved, you are more likely to capture a wider variety of experiences and changes. Smaller studies, while they can dive deep into specific experiences, might miss some of the broader range of outcomes that a larger group would reveal. This actually points to a potential limitation of many qualitative studies that have small sample sizes, suggesting they might not always capture the full diversity of client experiences. So, what does all of this mean? The main takeaway from this meta-method study is that client-reported psychotherapy outcomes are generally quite stable and robust. They don't seem to be dramatically shaped by the specific presenting issue, the type of therapy used, or even the theoretical leaning of the researchers. This strongly supports the idea of transdiagnostic and transtheoretical approaches in psychology. These approaches suggest that many of the core processes of change and growth in therapy are shared across different problems and different therapeutic models. It means that the deeply personal journey of change in therapy might have more in common than we often think. The finding about data collection timing is also really practical. It highlights that when assessing outcomes, especially behavioral ones, we need to consider the time it takes for changes to solidify and become evident in everyday life. Now, it is important to acknowledge the study's limitations. The authors are very clear that the frequencies they reported are based on the number of studies that mentioned an outcome, not the actual prevalence of that outcome in the entire client population. They are talking about the population of primary studies, not the population of people who go to therapy. Also, some of the groups they compared, like single issue versus multi-issue, were still pretty diverse, meaning some comparisons might have had more variation within them. And because this study builds on previous research, it inherits any limitations from those original studies, like incomplete reporting of information by the original researchers, which they had to address by contacting authors. This also underscores the need for researchers to be more transparent about their own positions and influences. In conclusion, this research suggests that what clients experience as meaningful change in psychotherapy is surprisingly consistent. This has big implications. For research, it means we don't necessarily need to limit studies to very specific diagnoses or therapy types to understand client outcomes. For everyday people seeking therapy, it is a reminder that many paths can lead to similar important areas of growth. The modest role of sample size also points to the value of larger, more diverse studies to get a fuller picture. And finally, the strong link between therapist approach and researcher orientation in the original studies highlights the need for researchers to be more open about their own perspectives. My take on this research is that it is a really valuable contribution because it centers the client's voice. It moves beyond just looking at symptom reduction and embraces the richer, more nuanced ways people experience growth. The consistency across different therapy types and presenting issues is powerful, suggesting that the human process of healing and change has common threads. It makes me think about how we define success in therapy and how that definition should absolutely include the client's own sense of what has improved. One thing that would be interesting to explore further is the not specifically related to psychotherapy category, understanding why and how therapy might facilitate changes that aren't directly about the therapy itself. Also, delving deeper into why behavioral changes are reported less immediately after treatment could be fruitful. This study gives us a lot to think about regarding the universal aspects of therapeutic change. It reinforces the idea that the therapeutic relationship and the client's own active engagement are likely key drivers regardless of the specific techniques used. If you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on client-reported outcomes, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science-backed insights. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.